Crash course on the Cuban Missile Crisis. What is the Cold War between USA and USSR? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a major event during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that occurred in October 1962. It is widely regarded as one of the closest moments to nuclear war in history. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is important to first understand the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was a political, military, and ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the end of World War II in 1945 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The two superpowers never directly engaged in military conflict, but they engaged in proxy wars, espionage, and an arms race. The United States and the Soviet Union were both vying for global influence and wanted to prove the superiority of their respective political and economic systems. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were in a constant state of tension. The two superpowers engaged in an arms race, each building up their nuclear arsenals to deter the other from attacking. This led to the development of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, which stated that if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate with overwhelming force, resulting in the destruction of both countries. One of the most significant events during the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the Soviet Union began secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, which is located just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. This was a significant threat to the United States, as it gave the Soviet Union the ability to launch a nuclear attack on the United States with little warning. The United States discovered the presence of the missiles through aerial reconnaissance, and President John F. Kennedy immediately convened a group of his top advisors to discuss the situation. The group, which became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, considered a range of options for responding to the Soviet threat. The options ranged from a naval blockade of Cuba to a full-scale invasion, but Kennedy ultimately decided on a naval blockade. He announced the blockade in a nationally televised address on October 22, 1962, and warned the Soviet Union that any attempt to breach the blockade would be considered an act of aggression that would be met with force. The Soviet Union initially refused to acknowledge the presence of the missiles in Cuba and denied any aggressive intentions. However, as the crisis unfolded, the two sides engaged in tense negotiations that brought the world closer to nuclear war. The Soviet Union eventually agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in the Cold War. It demonstrated the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy in resolving conflicts. It also led to the establishment of a direct communication hotline between the United States and the Soviet Union, which would be used to prevent future crises. One interesting story from the Cuban Missile Crisis involves Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet naval officer who was second in command of a submarine armed with nuclear torpedoes. The submarine was part of a fleet sent by the Soviet Union to support its efforts in Cuba, and it was being hunted by U.S. naval forces. When the U.S. Navy began dropping depth charges on the submarine in an attempt to force it to surface, the crew believed that a war had broken out and began preparing to launch a nuclear torpedo. However, Arkhipov refused to give the order to launch. He believed that the situation did not warrant the use of nuclear weapons and that the consequences would be catastrophic. His decision prevented a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Another interesting example from the Cuban Missile Crisis involves the role of communication in resolving the crisis. Throughout the crisis, there were many opportunities for miscommunication and misunderstanding between the United States and the Soviet Union. For example, when the U.S. announced the naval blockade, the Soviet Union saw it as an act of aggression and a violation of international law. The United States, on the other hand, saw the blockade as a defensive measure to protect its national security. However, through a series of back-channel communications, both sides were able to express their concerns and clarify their intentions. This included secret meetings between U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, as well as messages exchanged through intermediaries like journalist John Scully. Ultimately, it was communication that allowed the two superpowers to reach a peaceful resolution to the crisis. Both sides were able to understand each other's perspectives and find a way to avoid a catastrophic war. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains one of the most significant events in modern history, and it serves as a reminder of the dangers of nuclear weapons and the importance of diplomacy and communication in resolving conflicts. It also highlights the courage and leadership of individuals like John F. Kennedy and Vasily Arkhipov, whose decisions helped prevent a nuclear war that could have changed the course of history. Here are 10 confrontations between USA and USSR during the Cold War. 1. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the most significant confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Soviet Union secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which the U.S. discovered, leading to a tense standoff that nearly resulted in nuclear war. It was ultimately resolved through diplomatic negotiations. 2. Berlin Blockade and Airlift, 1948–1949. After World War II, the U.S., Britain, and France controlled West Germany, while the Soviet Union controlled East Germany. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, which was located in East Germany, cutting off all supplies to the city. The U.S. responded with an airlift that supplied the city with food and other essentials for almost a year, until the blockade was lifted. 3. Korean War, 1950–1953. The Korean War began when North Korea, with support from the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. The U.S. intervened, and the conflict turned into a proxy war between the two superpowers. The war ended in a stalemate, with the two Koreas remaining divided along the 38th parallel. 4. Vietnam War, 1955–1975. The Vietnam War was another proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. supported South Vietnam in its fight against communist forces in North Vietnam, which was backed by the Soviet Union. The war ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975 and the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. 5. Hungarian Uprising, 1956. In 1956, the Hungarian people rose up against Soviet control and demanded greater political and economic freedom. The Soviet Union sent troops to crush the uprising, leading to violent clashes and a crackdown on dissent. 6. Bay of Pigs Invasion, 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed attempt by the U.S. to overthrow the communist government in Cuba. The U.S. trained and armed Cuban exiles to invade Cuba, but the invasion was repelled by the Cuban military, with support from the Soviet Union. 7. Prague Spring, 1968. The Prague Spring was a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia, which was then under Soviet control. The reforms were met with opposition from the Soviet Union, which sent troops to crush the movement and maintain its control over the country. 8. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979–1989. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support the communist government in Kabul, leading to a long and brutal war. The U.S. provided support to Afghan rebels fighting against the Soviet-backed government, and the conflict became another proxy war between the two superpowers. 9. Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, 1969–1979. The SALT talks were a series of negotiations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union aimed at limiting the number of nuclear weapons each country possessed. The talks resulted in several agreements, including the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the SALT II Treaty. 10. Space Race, 1957–1975. The space race was a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to explore space and demonstrate technological superiority. The U.S. achieved several milestones, including putting the first man on the moon, but the Soviet Union had several accomplishments as well, including launching the first satellite and the first man in space. These confrontations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War had significant geopolitical, social, and economic implications, both for the superpowers and for the rest of the world. In summary, during the Cold War, The United States and the Soviet Union had many confrontations that shaped global politics and had significant consequences. These confrontations included the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Blockade and Airlift, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Hungarian Uprising, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Prague Spring, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, SALT, and the space race. These conflicts demonstrated the tension and competition between the two superpowers, as well as the significant impact of their actions on the rest of the world. *****. Start planning your next global adventure with ease and convenience with our Booking.com referral link. https://www.booking.com/index.html?aid equals 7989335 as a great choice to plan your next trip. You can find and book flights, hotels, cars, and local attractions all in one place, and their price match guarantee ensures you're getting the best deal. Thank you for kind support our AnHub Metaverse channel, and please watch more interesting videos here.